1936 America was crawling out of the Great Depression. Cities were hungry, farms were dry, and people were desperate to be remembered. But in the South, something different was happening. For the first time, the government turned its attention to a group it had long ignored, the people who had lived and died in chains. The Federal Writers Project, part of Roosevelt's New Deal, sent hundreds of interviewers across the country. Their task wasn't to build roads or factories. It was to collect voices, not politicians, not generals, but the last surviving men and women who had once been slaves. Their mission was simple: find them, sit with them, listen. Each interviewer carried a notebook, a typewriter, and a single instruction from Washington. Do not change their words. Do not clean them up. Record the truth exactly as they say it. Across Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas, old men and women sat on porches in the humid air, their hands trembling as they spoke. Some had scars still visible on their backs. Some couldn't remember their birthdays, but remembered the sound of a whip. They told stories that had never been written before, stories of being sold, of watching children torn from their arms, of working through sickness and rain because a master's word was law. They spoke about songs, not songs of joy, but songs of survival, whispered late at night in shacks lit only by firelight, songs that carried messages of escape and faith disguised as prayer. These were not historians or poets. They were survivors of America's original crime. Between 1936 and 1938, more than 2,000 interviews were recorded. 17 states contributed. Each word was transcribed, typed, and stored in the Library of Congress, becoming part of what we now call the slave narratives. For centuries, history had belonged to the powerful. But here, for the first time, the powerless got to speak. No filters, no justifications, just raw human truth, told by people who had lived through the darkest chapter of the American experiment. The government called it a folklore project. But what it really created was a mirror that showed what America had been built on, and the voices it had buried. Those interviews were not just documents. They were confessions. When the old slaves spoke, they did not ask for pity. They asked to be remembered. And that is how history learned to speak, not through books, not through monuments, but through trembling voices that refused to stay silent any longer. They called it the interview, but it wasn't a room, not really. Sometimes it was a wooden porch, creaking under the weight of time. Sometimes it was a dusty kitchen, a single chair and a notebook resting on a knee. The interviewers came from everywhere: teachers, journalists, poets, even failed novelists. Most of them were white, a few were black, and none of them had ever asked questions like these before. Where were you born? Who was your master? What do you remember of freedom? Simple questions, yet behind them lived a storm. For many of the old men and women, it was the first time anyone had asked them to remember, and the first time they were allowed to answer. Some hesitated. They had been punished once for speaking too freely. Even after 70 years, the fear of a master's anger lived in their bones. Others spoke fast, as if afraid the air itself might cut them off before they finished. Many cried. Some smiled. And some stared into the distance for long, empty minutes before whispering, "I ain't thought of that in a long, long time." The writers wrote everything down. Every word, every pause, every tremor in the voice. They were told not to change the dialect, not to clean up the speech, because in those broken sentences lived the truth of slavery. But not all interviews were pure. Some white interviewers softened what they heard, editing pain into politeness, turning horror into nostalgia. Yet even through those filters, the truth bled through. An old woman in Georgia described watching her mother whipped until she fainted. A man in Texas remembered his brother being sold down the river. Another recalled hiding in the woods, the sound of hounds closing in. These were not stories meant to entertain. They were memories clawed out of the dark, and while the interviewers may not have realized it, they were recording something no American history book had ever dared to write. The inner life of slavery, its fear, its numbness, and its strange surviving hope. The interviews didn't just capture words. They captured ghosts. Every question pulled another spirit out of the past. Every answer became a heartbeat in a nation that had forgotten how to listen. This was not just an interview. It was resurrection. They said memory fades with age, but the memories of the enslaved never faded. They fermented. When the interviewers asked, "What do you remember?" the answers came like floods breaking through old rotten dams. Some remembered the sound first. The sound of iron, the sound of horses, the sound of crying. One woman said, "I can still hear the chains singing in the morning." Others remembered smell, smoke, sweat and salt pork frying before sunrise. They spoke of mothers who hid food in their aprons, of fathers who were taken away and never came back. A man from Georgia recalled, "They whipped my mama for praying too loud." Another said, "My brother was sold when I was 10. He was crying for mama. I ain't heard that cry since, but it still ring in my ears." These were not stories of heroes or victories. They were stories of endurance, of surviving not because they wanted to live, but because dying was too easy. Yet even in the pain, there was something else. Something that refused to die. They talked about songs, old spirituals whispered in the fields. "Steal away, go down Moses, swing low, sweet chariot." Every song carried a hidden meaning, a message to run, to hide, to hold on just one more night. To the overseer, it was music. To the slaves, it was a code. They remembered dances under moonlight, stolen weddings in the dark, and laughter that defied the system built to erase it. "They couldn't beat the spirit out of us," one old man said. "They could take the flesh, but not the song." For the first time, America was hearing what it had chosen to forget. Every voice in those interviews, in cracked, trembling, scarred, was a witness to the crime that built a nation, a witness to the pain that shaped its soul. And in every word, in every pause, you could hear one truth rising above everything else. We were here. We survived. And we will be remembered. These were the voices of the past, not just memories but messages, sent forward through time, carried by the wind, the ink, and the trembling hands that wrote them down. Some stories were spoken aloud, but others were carried only in the eyes. The interviewers soon learned that pain doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just sits there, breathing quietly, waiting for someone brave enough to see it. Many of the old ex-slaves began their stories with a nervous laugh. "We had good times too," they'd say, but if you listened closely, you could hear what came after the laughter, the long silence, the shaking voice, the truth they weren't sure they were allowed to tell. In those pauses lived the real story, the story of children born into ownership, of women used and discarded, of families split and sold like cattle. Some of them still called their former masters Mr. or Mars, not out of respect, but habit. 70 years later, the language of obedience was still wrapped around their tongues. Others refused to say their masters' names at all. They'd just whisper, "He gone now." God judged him. For some, remembering was like reopening a wound that never healed. One woman in Mississippi broke down mid-sentence and said, "I don't want to talk no more. I done lived it once. That's enough." The pain wasn't just about what was done, it was about what was stolen. Childhood, love, freedom, the right to be human. And yet, even in that pain, something incredible survived. A kind of dignity that no whip could destroy. A man from Kentucky said, "They beat me till I bled, but I never called him master." Another woman remembered how her grandmother used to hum old hymns while hiding from the overseer, not because she was afraid, but because that song reminded her she still belonged to herself. These people carried the weight of generations, trauma passed down like an heirloom, buried deep in the silence of families who never had the words to describe it. And when the interviewers wrote those memories down, they were not just preserving history. They were uncovering something far more dangerous, America's buried guilt, because every sentence in those slave narratives was a quiet accusation, a reminder that progress had been built on bones, and the world that read those words couldn't look away anymore. The hidden pain had finally come to light, not through anger, not through revenge, but through remembrance, history. Once deaf was now forced to listen. When words failed, they sang. When the body was chained, the voice became the only thing still free. Long before America learned their names, the enslaved were creating a secret language, a language made of rhythm, sorrow, and defiance. They called them spirituals, songs that sounded like prayer to the overseer, but carried codes to the people. Steal away meant run tonight. Wade in the water warned, the dogs can't track you if you hide in the river. Go down Moses was never about Egypt. It was about the South, The plantation masters heard religion. The slaves heard freedom. Each note, each hum was an act of rebellion. Each chorus whispered a truth the world refused to see. We may be bound, but we are not broken. At night, after the fields went silent, the quarters came alive with sound, feet stomping in dust, hands clapping in rhythm, call and response echoing through the dark like heartbeat and thunder. They weren't just singing, they were remembering home before chains, remembering faces that had been sold away, remembering that joy, even stolen joy, was still theirs to claim. One woman told the interviewer, "We sang to keep from crying, but sometimes we sang to cry together." These songs crossed generations. They became gospel, blues, jazz, soul, the foundation of nearly every rhythm America would ever claim as its own. But they were born in fields of pain, from people who had nothing left but their breath and their belief. They sang because silence was surrender. They sang because it was the only weapon they had, and the only one their masters couldn't take. Through melody, they rewrote what freedom meant. Through harmony, they created a community that could not be enslaved. Each song was a map, a prayer, and a declaration. We are still here. The songs of survival weren't just music, they were proof. Proof that even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit finds a way to make light. No one forgot the day the word came, the day they were told, "You are free." For some, it came on horseback, a Union soldier shouting down a dusty road. For others, it came quietly, whispered from plantation to plantation like a rumor no one dared to believe. Freedom didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. It came in disbelief. One man from Mississippi said, "We thought the soldiers was lying. We didn't know what free even meant." Another remembered her master calling everyone to the yard. He read something off a paper and said, "You can stay if you want, or you can go." Some cried. Some laughed. Some stood silent, unsure if the earth beneath them had really changed. Freedom was supposed to be a new beginning, but for many, it was just another kind of survival. They left with nothing but rags on their backs and no land, no food, no promise. The chains were gone, but hunger replaced them. Yet even then they walked. Miles and miles in search of mothers, fathers, and children sold years before. One woman said, "I walked 3 days to find my boy. He didn't know me no more, but I knew him." Across the South, roads filled with people moving, people with no map, no money, but a fire in their chest that no one could put out. Churches were built. Names were chosen. Weddings were held, real weddings under the open sky, where no one owned anyone else. Some took the last name of their former masters, not out of loyalty, but to mark where they came from. Others made up new names, new identities, new beginnings, and still freedom was fragile. The night riders came. The old laws turned into new chains, but even then they refused to go back. Freedom, once spoken, could not be unsaid. One ex-slave told his interviewer, "When they told me I was free, I looked at my hands. I said, these hands is mine now. Ain't no man own them again." For the first time in history, the people who had built the South could finally claim themselves, not as property, not as workers, but as human beings. Freedom's day was not one day, and it was a long, slow awakening. And as the sun rose over broken fields, a new America began to breathe, born not from pride, but from pain that refused to die in silence. Freedom was supposed to be the end of the story. But for the people who had lived as property, it was only the beginning of another fight. When the Union soldiers left, the South didn't change overnight. The fields were the same, the owners were the same, only the rules were written in softer words. Some ex-slaves stayed on the plantations, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Others walked for miles searching for work, for land, for family, for something that felt like home. They built churches first, then schools. The church became their heart, the one place they could speak without fear, and the school became their weapon, the new kind of freedom, made of letters and books instead of chains and whips. But freedom came with danger. The Ku Klux Klan rode at night, white hoods, torches, and threats. They burned the new schools. They dragged teachers from their homes. They hung men who dared to vote. One old man said, "We was free in the day, but slaves again at night." The promises of freedom turned to ash in the mouths of those who had waited generations to taste it. The government called it Reconstruction. The freed people called it survival. They signed papers they couldn't read. They worked land they didn't own, sharecropping they called it, but it was slavery dressed in a suit. The ex-slaves told their children stories of the war, but not of the years after. Because those years were too bitter to tell. Still they endured. They planted seeds, not just in the ground but in the minds of their children. Learn, fight, rise higher than me. From those seeds came preachers, teachers and leaders, the first generation born free, carrying both pride and pain. Yet the shadow of the whip never truly vanished. Every time a man was denied a vote, every time a woman was told to know her place, the old ghost stirred again. The slave narratives captured this part too, the part where freedom wasn't a finish line, but a road with no clear end. A woman from Alabama said, "They told us we was free, but they never told us how to live free." And maybe that was the truth of it. Freedom was given, but equality had to be fought for inch by inch, generation by generation. The interviews end where history doesn't. The old voices fade, but their echoes remain in the hymns, in the stories, in the blood of a people who refused to vanish. After freedom came the struggle. After the struggle came resistance, and from that resistance came the roots of everything America still fights to understand today. Decades passed. The voices grew silent, but the words remained. Locked in boxes at the Library of Congress, thousands of pages sat waiting, typed in faded ink by writers who had once knocked on strangers' doors and asked them to remember. For years, no one read them. They gathered dust, ignored by schools, unseen by historians who preferred the comfort of cleaner stories. But truth never dies. It only waits. In the 1970s, new generations of scholars opened those boxes and heard voices that refused to be erased. Voices that spoke of chains, of courage, of small acts of rebellion that shaped the soul of a nation. The world finally began to listen. Books were written. Documentaries were made. Musicians sampled their words. Activists quoted their pain. And slowly the slave narratives became what they were always meant to be, a mirror. Not just a mirror for America, but for anyone who has ever forgotten who paid the price for their freedom. These interviews changed the way history was told. Before them, slavery was described by those who owned the whips. After them, it was told by those who bore the scars. Every "I remember" in those pages became a challenge to the idea that history belongs to the powerful, because history doesn't belong to the winners. It belongs to the witnesses. And the witnesses spoke. They spoke for the mothers who never saw their children again, for the men who died nameless in the fields, for the generations who learned to survive in silence. Their words became lessons, a reminder that freedom, once taken for granted, can vanish just as easily as it was given. A reminder that progress means nothing without memory. Today, their stories live in classrooms, in films, in art, in the rhythm of every protest song that dares to say, "We are still here." The Federal Writers Project began as a job for the unemployed, but it ended as something far greater, a resurrection of memory, a national confession, and a gift to the future. The old voices are gone now. Their porches are empty, their cabins collapsed. But listen closely. You can still hear them, in the wind, in the rhythm, in the heartbeat of a nation that finally learned to tell the truth about itself. This was never just a story of slavery. It was a story of endurance, of transformation, of a people who turned pain into power. And long after the pages fade, the legacy remains, written not in ink but in the human spirit that refused to be silenced. There is no record of Samuel Kincaid's death, but there are traces of his survival. In the systems that now study themselves, in the empires that rot from introspection, in the frightened awareness that power is never safe once it has been observed. His legacy is not flesh or blood. It is a method that replaced rebellion with recognition. The end of fear history measures liberation in proclamations and amendments, but real freedom begins the moment fear changes direction. The first slave to stop fearing his master didn't need emancipation papers. He had already escaped. That is the lesson the ledgers could not bury, and the laws could not erase. Control ends when awareness begins. Samuel proved it by forcing men to look inward until they collapsed. The modern world proves it again every time a government fears exposure, a corporation fears transparency, A liar fears being recorded. Fear used to maintain order. Now it sustains chaos. The philosophy of observation. Every generation rediscovers Samuel's principle under a different name: psychology, behavioral economics, systems theory, surveillance ethics. They all orbit the same truth. The observer changes the observed. It's the oldest paradox in science and the oldest weapon in oppression. He learned it without education, without instruments, only by watching. He didn't need language to define it. He used it to dismantle men who thought literacy meant superiority. And when he vanished, he left the equation behind like scripture carved into the bones of the world. To understand is to possess. Ownership built empires. Understanding dismantled them. The ghost in every system power keeps rebuilding itself with new technology and the same insecurity. From the whip to the warrant, from the overseer's gaze to the camera's lens, from plantation ledgers to corporate databases, the illusion is always the same, that watching others ensures control. But control depends on blindness. Every eye pointed outward forgets to guard what's within. Samuel exploited that flaw in one household. The rest of the world reproduced it at scale. Now the watchers are networks, governments, corporations, and every one of them trembles under the same curse, the fear that their own systems will see them clearly. 4. The last teacher. The myth says he didn't die. That somewhere in the wreckage of war he walked west until the horizon blurred, teaching those who listen to look closer, not to hate, but to see. A woman in New Mexico told her grandchildren that a man once taught her great-grandfather to study people the way they study the sky. A preacher in Louisiana claimed a stranger told him, "The eyes you fear are the ones that make you free." Maybe that was him. Maybe not, but the lesson traveled farther than his body ever could. The mirror of civilization. Every civilization invents its own Kincaid, the one who reminds it that authority is performance, and performance collapses under comprehension. Rome had its slaves who learned their masters' secrets. Europe had its heretics who read too much. America had its plantation genius who turned observation into revolution. Empires fall when they realize their reflection doesn't blink. 6. The Testament, if Samuel left a final message. It would read like this: I was not born to kill. I was born to understand. They mistook that for rebellion, because understanding is the death of command. Knowledge doesn't free the body. It frees the mind to refuse its chains. Once you see your oppressor's weakness, he no longer owns you, and once he knows you've seen it, he no longer owns himself. That is the true horror and the true freedom sound of Samuel Kincaid's legacy. 7. The epilogue. The courthouse still stands in Marshall, polished and preserved, its walls lined with plaques about heritage. But under the marble and bronze, beneath the floors tourists walk across without seeing. The soil remembers 7 unmarked graves, men who died from their own reflection. The tour guides never mention them. They talk about architecture and cotton. But some nights, when the lights dim and the building settles, janitors swear the air hums faintly, like a whisper from a man who never raised his voice. I did not need freedom. I became it, and maybe that's the end of the story, nor its beginning. Because every act of awareness, every truth spoken into silence, every gaze that refuses to lower itself, that's Samuel Kincaid, still alive, still watching, still teaching the world how to see.